We're going to use this figure to talk about a couple of the key features of developing appropriate lymphocytes. So we're kind of going back to this T cell maturation that occurs. So the analogy I'm going to use here to help us understand this figure is when you decide to go to school, right? And you decide to then go to college, all right? So thymus is like T cell college, okay? And when a T cell goes to college, it needs to learn two things. It needs to have self-recognition and immunological tolerance, all right? So basically, college for a T cell is a two-question exam, all right? And if you pass these two questions, you get to move on and go to a secondary lymphatic organ. So let's look at the first one. The question basically is, does the immature T cell, so that's the T cell that enters the thymus, recognize self-MHC proteins? Remember what the MHCs are. The MHCs are what's used to present antigen. All right? If you're a helper, you got to recognize the MHC2s. If you're a cytotoxic, you have to recognize the MHC1s. All right? If you don't, that's a bad T cell. All right? Because T cells have to be able to recognize the MHCs. By the way, MHC stands for major histocompatibility, because when we do tissue transplants and organ transplants, this is how we determine if there's compatibility. So if someone needs a kidney or a heart, the cells that we're giving them in the transplanted organ better have similar MHCs as the recipient. All right, because if they're different, then the immune system is not going to be able to recognize, and if it doesn't recognize, it might attack. All right, so the answer to this question is yes. All right, we're going to see whether the lymphocytes can recognize MHCs. And what that does is it allows the lymphocytes to recognize your own cells, right? Self means your own cells. So if you can do that, you get to pass. All right, so you pass the first test. The second question is the T cell receptor, remember what that is? That's the antigen receptor. Is it capable of binding to and recognizing self-peptides? These are proteins that your body makes. And the answer to this question better be no. Right? Because remember, the T cell receptor is supposed to recognize antigens, foreign peptides, not self-peptides. All right? So the answer to the first question is yes. The answer to the second question is no. You get to survive. If you get these questions wrong, you're going to be killed, right? Death, deleted, or at least inactivated. All right? So only the ones that answer these two questions survive. Then where do they go? They go to secondary lymphatic organs. All right? And then what happens? Well, you never know. If they ever recognize an antigen, they're going to get co-stimulated and then get activated. But if they don't, they might sit there forever. All right? And if they sit there for too long without participating, then they'll also kind of be inactivated or they'll die. All right? So self-recognition is the ability of lymphocytes to recognize MHC proteins. Immunological tolerance is the inability of the T cell receptor to recognize self proteins because we want them to recognize antigens. All right? Okay, this is a table, lists all the different cell types. We've talked about all these in one context or another. I'm not going to read this table, but this is a pretty good summary of different cells that function in the adaptive immune system. This describes types or ways you can get immunity. All right, so there's 4 basic ways to acquire immunity. All right, 2 of them are natural ways, 2 of them are artificial methods, 2 of them are active, and 2 of them are passive. So let's look at just what active versus passive means. Active immunity means it's your own immune system that was activated, and that is going to lead to proliferation and activation of lymphocytes. All right, that can be done naturally or artificially. Passive immunity is when you get immunity from another person. Okay, or it says animal. We can make antibodies in an animal and then give them to you. But the idea is antibodies are given to you. All right, and that can be done naturally or artificially. Okay, so let's put them all together. Active or natural active immunity or active natural immunity is when you have antigens introduced through natural exposure. So you pick up a virus, you pick up a bacterium, your immune system gets activated, and you fight that infection, which then leads to immunity. All right, so that's naturally active immunity. Artificial active is basically a vaccination, right? Vaccines are artificial, they're introduced, it activates your immune system, you develop memory lymphocytes, and you develop immunity. All right, let's look at the passive methods. The natural ways are through the placenta. So there are some antibodies that will cross from the pregnant woman into the fetus and protect the fetus, or through breast milk. Breast milk has antibodies. When a baby feeds on the breast milk, they can get some of those antibodies absorbed into them. All right, so this is naturally passive immunity. Artificial passive, we can get antibodies from someone else, draw them out, all right, so we can take their blood, we can separate the plasma that contains the antibodies, and we can introduce them into someone else. That's an artificial, but it's passive. So your immune system doesn't get activated, you just have antibodies from someone else. And then again, we can engineer or make antibodies using animals or in culture, and then those can be given by injection. All right, so that's both artificial, passive. Last couple things are some disorders or diseases. So hypersensitivity is when someone's immune system overreacts to something. So this is basically an allergic reaction. All right, so someone who has an allergy, their immune system is hypersensitive, meaning there are things that normally don't cause this dramatic reaction, but will if your immune system's hypersensitive. So some common allergens are milk, peanuts, shellfish, eggs. Some people are allergic to certain antibiotics. Some people are allergic to vaccines or components. Some people are allergic to venoms like from bee stings, wasps, snakes. Some people develop allergies from cosmetics. And then some plants can cause allergy. What is basically causing the reaction? Basophils and mast cells producing large amounts of histamine. Remember the IgE class of antibodies. There's also the prostaglandins and leukotrienes that cause major inflammation. So what happens with an allergy? You get severe vasodilation, right? So you get a lot of redness, swelling because of the capillary permeability. You could get airway constriction, which is the most life-threatening response, and you get a lot of mucus production. So mucus and respiratory constriction can lead to problems breathing. Notice over here we have asthma, which is basically a hypersensitivity, So it has a lot of the same problems as an allergy. But notice you get the buildup of mucus in the airway. You also get this constriction of the muscle of the airways. All right. Treatments, we have anti-inflammatories. You could, if it's a minor hypersensitivity, you could give NSAIDs like Motrin. If it's a little bit more severe, you could give antihistamines like Benadryl. And then if it's really severe in that it's affecting the airways, you can give a shot of epinephrine, an EpiPen. And the EpiPen, the epinephrine, will relax this muscle and hopefully open up those airways. All right, so that's hypersensitivity, aka allergy or allergic reactions, or anaphylaxis is another name for this severe allergy. And then the last thing is when the immune system turns on you. So instead of attacking a foreign substance, it starts to attack self proteins. So this is when the immune system doesn't display the self-tolerance. Remember, self-tolerance means you're not going to react to self-proteins. If you lose that or fail to display self-tolerance, you're going to attack your own tissue or proteins. 5% of people in North America and Europe are diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. Females tend to be more likely to have an autoimmune disease. Some examples include Graves' disease, myasthenia gravis. These are interesting because Graves' disease doesn't really attack the thyroid. Its antibodies mimic the thyroid stimulating hormone. So Graves' disease is actually a form of hyperthyroidism because the antibodies actually stimulate the thyroid. Myasthenia gravis is the antibodies block the receptors for skeletal muscle contraction. So if you block all the receptors, you can't stimulate muscle as well. So myasthenia gravis leads to very weak muscles, hard to walk. In some severe cases, the diaphragm becomes very weak and they have trouble breathing. Type 1 diabetes is destruction of the beta cells. If you don't have beta cells, you can't produce enough insulin. MS, or multiple sclerosis, is an attack on the myelin that surrounds neurons. So it can lead to kind of rigid muscle contraction. Rheumatoid arthritis attacks joints. Lupus is systemic, so it can attack a lot of different organs, kidneys, brain, and other tissues. Celiac disease, we've probably heard of. That's an autoimmune attack on the small intestine that leads to digestive problems. Treatments really depends on the severity. It depends on the specific disease. Some treatments include steroids, which are immunosuppressant. There are other immunosuppressant drugs. We could try to remove the antibodies. That's called plasmapheresis. We try to get those antibodies out of the bloodstream. In really, really severe cases, they might remove the thymus, but that's kind of a dangerous situation. But again, autoimmune diseases all have one thing in common, is that they fail to display self-tolerance and start to attack the person's own tissues. All right, so hopefully, if anything, the immune system gives you, some appreciation of how complicated it is and how strong it is and how useful it is. So that brings us to the end. Like I always say, good luck, and let me know if any topics are giving you trouble. There is a separate video where I go over a drawing that can be found in your study guide. I think that video is going to be very good at clarifying some of the little details that we talked about.